All right, hi everyone. My name is Axel Bruns, and I'm here with my colleagues Dan Angus, Abdul Obeid, and James Meese. Dan and Abdul and I are from the Queensland University of Technology. James Meese is from RMIT University in Melbourne. We are all here on behalf of the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society to present our paper, which we'll also present in person, of course, in Paris. So let me jump right into our presentation and get the slides up. So we are presenting on a project by the Center for Automated Decision Making and Society on the personalization of search results. We're focusing here particularly on Google News results as they're presented to Australian users. Let me begin by giving you some background to this study. In fact, let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country upon which we live and work, the Turrbal and Yagara people here in Brisbane, and the traditional owners of the lands all around Australia where our colleagues are working. We acknowledge them as the First Nations owners of the lands where QUT now stands, pay respect to their elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits, and recognize that these lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning. And we'd like to acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within the QUT community and the communities of all of our partner institutions. Now, this project is investigating the personalization of search results. This is, of course, an ongoing debate. There have been questions for the best part of a decade about how personalized search results are, whether in fact they are personalized and what effects of that personalization might be. We've had talk about filter bubbles being produced by these personalized search results, information inequality resulting as different demographics get different search results. And of course, there's also a question of how this all evolves over time, particularly in the context of emerging topics. Our project explores this by using a browser plugin that was originally developed by our project partners Algorithm Watch for a study in Germany. Our current version of the plugin queries 4 search engines: Google Search, Google News, Google Video, and YouTube. But in this presentation, we'll focus particularly on Google News results. We invite people to install this plugin, and the plugin then runs every few hours and runs a number of search queries that we've got lined up. So essentially, it is as if our participants, our citizen scientists, are themselves searching in their browsers. So we're piggybacking onto their personal profiles that Google has assembled for them. Our plugin runs these searches both as a desktop or a mobile browser. So it essentially pretends to be a desktop or mobile device. And it follows the overall philosophy of data donations from the general public, because this is the only way for us to investigate from the outside what search results actual people actually see. Initially, this was developed for a study in 2017 around the German federal election then by Algorithm Watch. Our version, updated version of this plugin launched in late July 2021, has been going ever since. There is a large number of colleagues from the Center of Excellence involved in this project. And we four are the team that's worked specifically on this Google News aspect for the time being. For more information, you can also go to our website and in fact install the browser plugin if you're based in Australia. This is what the website looks like. So this takes people through the plugin installation process for Chrome, Firefox, or Edge. Unfortunately, because Safari works significantly differently, we're unable to support that browser or in fact mobile devices. So we can mimic mobile devices, but we can't have the plugin installed on those devices. So again, all of this ultimately addresses, in part at least, the question of filter bubbles, and there's been quite a bit of work already done on this. Past studies have investigated news search results in a number of different ways. There have been a number of mid-scale tests that have either used fake profiles, so account profiles on for Google that have been trained to look like conservatives or liberals in the US particularly. And the study by Nehrostai and Lewis in particular found that 5 news sources dominated search results, independent of whether these accounts had been trained to be, liberal or conservative, or whether also when they used actual people that identified as conservative or liberal. There were very few differences between the results returned to either side. In fact, this study concluded there's almost too much uniformity in results, and it would be nice if there was more diversity in the news sources being recommended. A similar study was done by Heim et al. In Germany as well and found much the same things. Our colleagues at Algorithm Watch, as I say, have used this browser plugin before in the context of the German election in 2017 and found that there was very little personalization across their 1,500 or so participants in the data donation project. When they searched for the names of German political parties and politicians, they found very much identical search results across the board. And in 5 to 10% of all cases, results were even presented in the same order across different participants. So there is very little evidence on that basis, at least, for filter bubbles in search as far as Google News Search is concerned, or Google Search itself is concerned. And as you may know, I've written quite a bit more about this in recent times as well. We now want to replicate this work for the context of Australia through our Australian Search Experience project. And what we're presenting in the remainder of this presentation are the first results from that work. Of course, our results will be updated further by the time we get to Paris and present this in person. So for the purpose of this paper, we are limiting ourselves to Google News results only. We're not looking at the other platforms that we're also covering. So that's Google News in the Google tab, in the Google searches, of course. We're also drawing on the news publisher field as Google News results themselves identify it. So we're aggregating at the level of publisher rather than at the level of individual stories. And we're doing this for a broad range of search terms, which I'll introduce in a moment. We're also limiting ourselves only to the first 10 search results coming up for our participants. So that's essentially the first page of results, because we know that most ordinary searches will not normally go past the first page of results. And we have limited our analysis here to the fourth quarter of 2021 to have a solid amount of data to work with. We can, of course, simply count the number of search results per publisher that appear in any kind of search and aggregate that up across this time frame and across the different searches that we're making. We also want to introduce another measure, though, called weighted influence, which assumes that people are more likely to look at the top-ranked results in searches than at the bottom-ranked results. So we calculate weighted influence by essentially assigning a score from 10 to 1 in reverse order to the results that are being presented to users. So essentially, if the same publisher appears 3 times listed in first position in 3 different searches, then it would gain a weighted influence score of 30. If it was listed 3 times in last position, it would gain a weighted influence score only of 3. In the example that I'm showing here on the right, for instance, Sky News Australia appears both in first and last position, so its weighted influence would be 11, whereas all the other ones appear only once and would get only the score as indicated here. This is an attempt for us to introduce an influence score, obviously. We could, of course, introduce other forms of weighting, exponential weighting, higher weighting for the top results and so on. We also want to be quite careful, though, at the same time, not to overweight the top results, because it isn't at all clear that people are spending a great deal more time with the first few listed results than the bottom ones on the same first page. So we have opted here for a very basic linear weighting. We will, of course, explore other opportunities down the track as well, but we're also very careful not to introduce an overly aggressive weighting here that might lead our results to be misleading. Then the next thing I should introduce are our search terms. We have grouped them broadly into domestic politics, international politics, COVID, finance, and other. And you see on screen here the sorts of terms that we're using. For domestic politics, we're largely following the original Algorithm Watch study by using the names of the major Australian political leaders and political parties, as well as two additional terms, the Uluru Statement and Voice to Parliament, to deal particularly with Indigenous politics. For international politics, we've selected broadly a range of particular hot button issues over the last few months. For COVID, there are a number of the obvious key terms, as well as some more lengthy searches that are also likely to be used by actual users. For finance, we're focusing largely on loans and superannuation, and then there are a number of other search terms that are a broad range of terms right across other searches that people might make. So this is the overall list of search terms and the groupings that we've applied to them, and we'll work with both individual search terms and groupings in what I present in the following. Let us first then look at the major sources being recommended to, again, echo what Nehushta and Lewis have done already. Here across all of the keywords that we're using, these are the overall top sources being recommended. And we're showing here both in blue a simple count of the times that these sources appeared in our search results, and in orange, the weighted influence score that's calculated from these appearances. You see there that there isn't a huge deal of difference between these two measures. We see perhaps the greatest deviation is that the Sydney Morning Herald, which is roughly in the middle of this table, appears fairly frequently, but its weighted influence is below what we would expect, which would mean that the Sydney Morning Herald, while it appears on many first pages of search results, appears more often down the bottom of the list, whereas sources like the New York Times, Daily Mail, and the Washington Post, when they do appear more often towards the top of the list. But as you see there also, the deviations are reasonably limited. Overall, this list of top news sources is fairly predictable. We've got the Australian Public Service News Organization, ABC News. We've got The Guardian, both in its international and Australian version, New York Times, the tabloid The Daily Mail, the broadsheet Sydney Morning Herald, news.com.au, the Washington Post, Forbes, and the right-wing news outlet Sky News Australia. So a fairly broad mix of news outlets, both quality and tabloid, both from Australia and international, and in many ways very much established outlets. There is nothing here that is particularly out of the ordinary as far as news outlets are concerned. If we break this down by the keyword groups, and of course you're very welcome to pause the video at any time to have a longer look at these graphs. Again, we see that the selection of outlets, of course, varies by the category of keywords. In domestic politics, we've got an almost exclusive list of Australian news outlets. In international politics, we've got more particularly US based and some UK based outlets as well. In finance, of course, we've got a lot more finance outlets as well. But again, there's nothing particularly surprising here in terms of the outlets. We have no fringe or otherwise very minor outlets that appear, at least for domestic and international politics, COVID, and even finance. And again, the deviation between the count and weighted influence scores is limited for the most part, except perhaps in other where Healthline appears very frequently, but often towards the bottom of the list, as the much lower weighted influence score indicates. Looking then a little bit further here also at the percentage of total results that each of these outlets contributes, we see, for instance, that for domestic politics, The Guardian Australia accounts for more than 7% of all news story recommendations that we've seen. in total, these top 10 outlets in domestic politics account for more than 40% of all recommendations that we've seen. So the recommendations for Australian news are very much focused on these top 10 outlets. 2/5, essentially, more than 2/5 of all recommendations are just for these 10 outlets. For international politics and for COVID, there is slightly more variability. Less than a quarter of all search results are accounted for by these 10 top international politics outlets. But at the same time, outlets like The Guardian, for instance, still account for nearly 77% of all results. So we see still significant concentration on these top outlets. Of course, there isn't really a straight comparison between domestic politics and international politics because of the specific search terms that we've used either. But you see there that these top outlets certainly account for a very significant amount of the search results that we've been seeing. So in many ways, this already supports one of the findings by Nehrestein and Lewis, who found that Google News rankings highlight long-standing national newspapers and TV networks in the US case over local and younger news organizations. Though we're not obviously looking at the US, our results so far seem to very much support this, both in Australia, both for Australian topics as well as for international topics. We are seeing recommendations that point very, very strongly to the major news outlets at the Australian and international level. We're not seeing much in terms of recommendations for local news outlets or new entrants into the news environment. So very much the usual suspects are being recommended first and foremost by Google News. When we look further then at personalization across different demographic aspects, I'll take you through a number of graphs here fairly quickly. Again, please feel free to pause at any time, where we're comparing both for the keyword groups overall and for specific keywords across different demographic categories. In this particular case, we're looking at keyword groups across gender, as our participants have identified themselves. I should say here that we have relatively few participants who identify as other than male or female genders. So the last column there for others should be taken with a grain of salt. We simply have much smaller numbers of participants there. But between male and female participants, essentially what we're seeing here is that there is very little variation in terms of the search results. So if Google has inferred the gender of our participants through their searches or other activities, this is not manifested in the search results that they're getting back for their searches. We're seeing that the overall distribution of outlets being recommended for male and female participants is very much the same. There are some very minor variations. For instance, in the COVID category, women appear to be getting slightly more recommendations for BBC News content than others, but none of this is particularly pronounced, so we are loath to read anything further into this. If we look at selected keywords here, and I've selected mainly the current Australian Prime Minister and opposition leader, as well as the major parties in terms like COVID and feminism, again, we're seeing virtually no major differences between male and female participants. Even perhaps for a term like feminism, where we could reasonably expect that men and women might be getting slightly different recommendations, but that simply isn't the case here. We see essentially no difference between those two categories of demographics. If we move on to state, there are some slightly more pronounced differences. Here we're focusing on New South Wales, Queensland, and Victoria, because this is where our major user bases are. We have far fewer users from other states and territories around Australia, so these have been grouped together into other. What we're seeing here, which is interesting but not yet explicable for us, is that Queenslanders seem to be getting fewer recommendations for the ABC, our national public broadcaster. Proportionally, they get more recommendations for Guardian Australia and the Daily Mail. And that is certainly true for domestic politics. It is less pronounced, but still true for ABC News, for international politics as well, certainly also for COVID and some of the other categories. It is not entirely clear to us, frankly, why that would be the case, what might be driving this. So we're keen at this point to further investigate this deviation. We cannot yet interpret what might be behind these differences. If we look at selected keywords, again, this is also borne out further. For instance, as we look at these specific search terms, again, that link to some of the minor party leaders, to lockdown and vaccine, we're seeing there that, for instance, in vaccine at the bottom, Queenslanders get fewer recommendations for ABC News. But at the same time, the New York Times is perhaps more often represented in search results. So again, it is not entirely clear why that would be the case for users in Queensland, participants in Queensland, as opposed to participants in New South Wales or Victoria, for instance. But this is a pattern that seems fairly stable across these states. So this is something that we intend to investigate further. If we move on then to the education levels that our participants have reported for themselves, grouped here into year 12 or less, bachelor degree level, postgraduate degree level, or others and prefer not to say. Again, we see some differences there between these education level groups. For instance, on domestic politics, users with year 12 or less receive fewer recommendations for ABC News and more recommendations for the Daily Mail. So this could be seen at face value as Google News providing lower quality news, perhaps, more tabloid news to users with a lower education level. However, the same pattern is somewhat less pronounced, but also true for users with a postgraduate degree level. So it's not entirely clear why the pattern here should be the same between year 12 or less and postgrad level participants. It really is the bachelor level participants who get proportionally more ABC News. And again, there is no obvious reason for why that would be the case. We see this for domestic politics. We see it quite pronounced also for COVID as a search term. Here we see again that the bachelor degree level group particularly gets disproportionately many recommendations for ABC News when that outlet drops down significantly for year 12 or less, and slightly less so for postgrad level. Again, while it might be tempting to interpret this for year 12 or less as Google providing more tabloid quality news to people with a lower level of education, the same is in many ways also true for postgraduate level participants. So we're not seeing a really obvious reason for why these patterns should be as they are. Looking there again at selected keywords, we see this repeated again also in very specific search terms. Again, the search term COVID as opposed to the category of COVID search terms sees bachelor level participants get a very substantial number of recommendations for ABC News. Well over 15% of all search results point to ABC News, whereas for year 12 or less, fewer than 10% of all search results point to ABC News, and proportionally far more point to The Guardian and to BBC News. So that's a pattern that isn't easily explicable for us at this point, and that we'll further investigate, of course. Looking then also at broad age categories, and we've grouped participants here together as ages 18 to 34, 35 to 54, and 55 and over. We see again some minor fluctuations, although these are not particularly pronounced across these different age categories. The prefer not to say group, of course, varies quite a bit more, but again, our numbers of participants in that category are far smaller, so this could simply be statistical fluctuation without any significant meaning. And if we look for age, then also at specific keywords, again, we see very little variation between these major age groups across these selected keywords. We see for vaccine, for instance, that both younger and older users are getting proportionally more New York Times results, whereas middle-aged users are getting more ABC News. But why that would be the case is not entirely clear to us at this point and requires further investigation. So summing all of this up, then really what we're seeing is that, again, the observations by Nehushta and Lewis seem to be very much confirmed by our results as well. Although Google will certainly have some detailed profile information about the people who've chosen to participate in our project, its search algorithms, at least for Google News, are not apparently using that information to produce very different news diets for these different participants. Rather, what we're seeing are, as very much in the same vein as Nehushta and Lewis reported, highly centralized, highly unified news diets across these different demographics. And in many ways, what users of all ages, genders, and other demographic factors are getting seems to be very, very similar. That is, again, a very strong argument, of course, against the idea of filter bubbles. It's in some ways also reassuring that people right across society appear to be seeing the same search results rather than vastly different results for the same search terms. But of course, some more news personalization might in fact be desirable for different users with different backgrounds, different locations, different interests possibly as well. So while we see these results as broadly positive, some more personalization might in fact be desirable for some of our users as well. Speaking then briefly just about the future plans in our project, we will, of course, broaden this out again now to the other platforms for which we're also gathering data, so Google Search, Google Video, and YouTube, and compare these patterns across multiple search platforms. We intend to further investigate which specific demographic attributes might be driving these minor differences in search results that we're seeing, and whether perhaps also there are links to the particular browser features or other aspects that we are also capturing. We may have some of that work completed also by the time that we present this in Paris. We are also capturing, of course, information on non-organic search results, and here too we're interested to see whether there's evidence of a targeting of particular demographics with promoted results in some way. And of course, we can also look further at the individual results being provided, the individual stories being recommended, to see what the quality of search results actually is for particular search terms. Of course, we're also fully aware that the demographic profile overall of our citizen scientist cohort is still relatively uneven, and we're taking steps to adjust this further, both by recruiting additional participants, but also by applying normalization adjustments in order to get a much better sense of the overall patterns across these demographic groups. We will continue to compensate for participant attrition over time as well. Of course, not all of the users who've signed up at the start will continue to provide their search results while the project is running. We have already begun to vary the search terms as well to address emerging topics from the Tokyo Olympics to the war in Ukraine. And of course, as we are now in the middle of an Australian federal election, we are also very interested to see how the search terms for that particular event might vary across demographics or might vary over time as well. Thank you very much for listening to this point, and we hope to present more on this in Paris when we meet as well. Thank you very much.